Good afternoon and a very warm welcome back to the LSE German Symposium. The discussion of the Euro has always been a central part of our events, from Wolfgang Schäuble to Klaus Regling. They have all contributed to our debates. Today we also had some central bankers, 6 in fact, and now we are delighted to come full circle to fiscal policies together with Minister Paschal Donohoe, Minister for Finance of the Republic of Ireland and President of the Eurogroup. So we're really delighted to have you with us this afternoon. And the event will be chaired by Andrés Velasco, Dean of the School of Public Policy here at the London School of Economics and an experienced politician and economist. So we are in good hands this afternoon. And now to you, Professor.
Thank you very much, Maurice. Minister, welcome to the LSE, delighted to host you. As Maurice said, my name is Andrés Velasco. I am the Dean of the School of Public Policy at the LSE. And I'd like to begin by congratulating the German Society at the school for the extraordinary event they've put together. And what a great guest with whom to continue our deliberations. I was once the Minister of Finance of another small country, Chile, on the other corner of the world. And I was the Minister of Finance during the world financial crisis 10, 12 years ago. So I know full well what an extraordinary time it is to be a Minister of Finance during a crisis. And I can only imagine what Minister Donohoe has been doing, working for the long days and the long nights, all of it, of course, for a very noble and important cause. Paschal Donohoe is the Minister for Finance of the Republic of Ireland. He is the chair of the Eurogroup. He was trained, like many distinguished Irish figures, at Trinity College Dublin. He also lived in London for 5 years. And he is a recognized and authoritative voice, with very firm views on the subject of today, which is, of course, the Euro, the past, the present, and the future of the Euro, which is a monetary matter, but it is also a political matter and a fiscal matter, and therefore a senior Minister of Finance, chair of the Eurogroup, is the ideal person to deal with the questions that arise from that very, very important issue. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to the Minister, who will speak for about 20 or 25 minutes. Then I will use my chair's privilege to ask a couple of questions, and then we will open it up to Q&A from the floor. Again, Minister Donohoe, welcome to the LSE. The floor is yours.
Well, good afternoon, Professor. Good afternoon to everybody. And thank you very much for the opportunity to address the LSE German Symposium. And I'd like to thank the Professor for his very nice introduction. Thank you very much. And I look forward to the questions and answers and the discussion with the good Professor in a moment. While these kind of virtual events have become very much part of how we are engaging today and how we interact with each other, I have to say that it's at moments like this that I particularly miss how we used to be able to engage with each other physically. From a coffee before something like this, to standing in a room in front of you all, and participating in a debate physically were the ways in which we could engage with each other in the past. But I'm delighted to be doing it here today, virtually. But again, I'm particularly aware at a moment at an event like this of how much change there has been in our daily lives and the very challenging times we are now in. Because what the past year has demonstrated to us is the very preciousness and the inherent unpredictability of life. Right across Europe, and indeed right across the world, all ages have begun to speak euphemistically of what we refer to as the new normal. But in truth, what we have been responding to is an altered reality. Indeed, pandemics, or to use a different phrase, the concept of plagues, for want of a better word, have been part of the human experience since time immemorial. It is only with the advent of modern medicine and healthcare that the majority of our citizens in this part of the world have had the luxury to view them as something of the past, an abstraction, something for somebody else to worry about and confront at another time in a different place. But in the words of Albert Camus, the great European and French writer, in his very prescient novel, when reading it today, The Plague, he wrote, and I quote, "When the abstraction sets to killing you, you've got to get busy with it." And this is what we have all done across the world. Healthcare workers, scientists, policymakers, politicians, central bankers, people from all walks of life have got busy, first with adjusting, and second to fighting back. We are reacting to the immediate impact of this disease in health, in economic and in social terms, but also crucially, we are plotting towards, we are advancing near the path to recovery. And so great are the interconnected challenges that we face now that I believe if the European Union had not existed before this crisis, we would now be beginning the very slow process of creating it. So it's in these circumstances that I'm honoured to address you today. This year, we will celebrate the 20th anniversary of the euro as a physical currency, and we will celebrate and mark this moment at a time of great upheaval. But we will also mark the 70th anniversary of the Schuman Declaration. This was framed against the backdrop of an existential European conflict. The Schuman Declaration spoke of the value of practical solidarity, the vision that amidst suffering, there was enough hope to build a better future upon, to build indeed a better Europe. And this is surely what Schuman meant when he said that Europe will not be made all at once or according to a single plan. It will be built through concrete achievements which first create a de facto solidarity. So, I want to give you my perspectives as president of the Eurogroup on focusing on how Europe has responded to COVID-19 economically and how we can improve and build upon this response to contribute to a better Europe and to contribute to a better world. I'll be addressing two broad points. First, I'd like to reflect on the first 20 years of the euro with a focus on crisis management, given that we now are facing two once-in-a-generation shocks. Second, I want to look forward to address what I think is needed from a politician's perspective to ensure a sustained and robust economic recovery as opposed to just a temporary rebound. And I want to emphasize this point. To put it simply, as the process of vaccination increases and restrictions ease, we will automatically see a pickup in growth. For example, through the release of pent-up demand, which we can see inherently in current savings patterns. However, it is critical to look beyond an initial surge in activity, and as policymakers, we need to think about the kind of growth that is sustainable. A rebound and a recovery are different. We will need to provide confidence and certainty. So, over the past 20 years, over the past 2 decades of the euro, we have seen so many events and so much challenge, but we have made such progress. I distinctly remember the debates prior to the launch of the euro. Economists, commentators, the occasional politician, energetically engaged on theories of optimum currency areas, fiscal harmonization, price and wage alignment, sovereignty arguments, and so on. There were certainly many arguments against the euro. Some saw it as impractical, as too ambitious, as coming too soon, and argued it wouldn't survive its first major challenge. The argument was made that the architecture behind it was incomplete. How could, they asked, the euro operate? But for me, the first tangible sign of success came from the sheer speed at which the euro was adopted in everyday life. In Ireland, as in other member states, people took to the euro very quickly, within weeks. There are many ways indeed then to look at this shared currency. However, most resonantly is the fact that, like all money, it is based on trust. At its most fundamental, the euro is a political construct built on trust with inherently political foundations. Upon these foundations, all else is built. Today, the euro has become the second most important currency in the international financial system after the dollar. This currency, at its heart, is an expression of shared values. So, we should through this look at how the euro has fared during times of challenge and crisis. Looking back at the last 12 months, Europe has responded economically, and I think the euro and its institutions showed its worth. This is not to say there have been no mistakes, no difficulties, and no bumps along the road, because there surely has been. However, much of this at times is inevitable. It reflects the process at the heart of the euro, simply reflecting the fact that, for example, when we were dealing with the great financial crisis, the currency was still in its relative youth. The infrastructure behind us was developing. The euro was designed to make our borders invisible, to provide stability, and to facilitate our shared interconnectedness and our shared interdependence. These latter two words emphasize to me the focus of this speech, how the euro has fared during times of crisis, the sovereign debt crisis, and now the one of today. We can see in each case that the euro faced these enormous challenges and its architecture evolved. The financial crisis threatened to derail European integration, but ultimately it forged a stronger common purpose and a more robust common currency. Similarly, from COVID-19, the euro will emerge even more resiliently, driven by the form of collective action we have seen over the past 12 months. The sovereign crisis was our first test. At its most fundamental, the creditworthiness of the euro itself was under threat as that form of contagion spread. This culminated in a number of member states, including my own, requiring formal financial assistance, followed by very difficult periods of change and structural reform. But this very broadly necessitated the creation of new institutions, of new practices, and new procedures. Without naming them all, it included, for example, the setting up of the European Stability Mechanism, the ESM, changes in respect of banking supervision and regulation, and the setting up of the single supervisory mechanism. There were also a series of reforms to the fiscal rules and the overall fiscal framework, with an appreciation of the need for greater levels of economic oversight. On reflection, the crisis then demonstrated that the euro area was initially not fully equipped in the face of such a broad shock. But our political institutions evolved. They did, over time, respond to and rise to the challenge. And far from being a weakness, the invisible borders of our European community eventually allowed a political consensus on the need to introduce new structures, practices, and solutions to protect our citizens from future shocks. And they have been used now, because many of the measures, many of the safeguards that we put in place then have been critical today in dealing with a new contagion, but this time a biological one, COVID-19. Ironically, the very disease that threatens our shared collectiveness and freedom of movement has been met by greater European economic inclusivity. Over the past year, the speed of this change has been unprecedented. In contrast to the financial crisis, which some claimed was an existential crisis for our currency itself then, the euro, through its response, will, I believe, position itself as a key asset in a European recovery, and indeed as a symbol of what we can achieve together. And as president of the Eurogroup, I have seen this literally on a daily basis. I'd pick three examples of it. First, that member states have been allowed to use their various economic policies to act in full, enabled by the quick decision of the Commission to suspend EU fiscal rules last March, as well as changing the state aid framework. These decisions sent a clear signal to financial markets that our response to this crisis would be different. The level of borrowing over the past year to protect incomes and employment and to fund the enormous health response has been unprecedented. Second, at a broader European level, what has been done, I would respectfully this afternoon make the case that on an economic level, it has been remarkable. This includes, for example, the three key safety nets agreed by the Eurogroup to the value of 540 billion euro. The SURE programme, the ESM's pandemic crisis support, and the EIB's Pan-European Guarantee Fund. These schemes are now all fully operational, and the success, for example, of the SURE scheme in particular, in terms of how member states access it, and also in respect of how oversubscribed bond offerings have been, speaks volumes. The Eurogroup also agreed last November to the ESM treaty reform and the early introduction of the backstop to the SRF. These reforms mean that crisis-related funding will flow in a more efficient, in a more effective manner. But on top of this, we also have the new EU Recovery Fund that has the potential to channel over 700 billion euro of investment to where it's needed most in Europe, to intensify cooperation, to equip our economies for the future. And then critically, the third element of our response centres on our independent central bank, the ECB, which has been decisive in its monetary policy actions, notably through the Pandemic Emergency Purchase Programme. These are tangible actions from our institutions, from member states, to deliver real results. They're protecting lives, they're protecting livelihoods, and versus where we were before, there are two crucial differences. First, our actions have been so much more coordinated in terms of what we said and how we've acted. And then secondly, there was much greater shared recognition of the challenge. Consequently, economic responses have been fast, they have been honed, and they have been built on consensus. And as somebody who's a very proud European, this has reminded me of the importance of coordinated action and that we grow better together if we support each other. But simply, no individual action can be as effective as joint action. So while COVID was unimaginable a year ago, some of the EU's responses, such as the Recovery Fund or the SURE programme, would equally have likely been unimaginable a year ago too. So a lot has been achieved. But I think it's also fair to say that many of our responses were emergency in nature. Often at times, indeed, our instruments were wide and blunt because we were acting in an emergency. This is to be expected given the urgent circumstances we faced. All hands were on deck. While we are now dealing with the unthinkable, the easy thing to do would be to focus on today. The emergency response could be to steady the ship and restore and fix what has been broken. And while at times we would love to welcome back some of the old normal, many of us would even settle for some parts of that to be back. However, we cannot applaud ourselves or recognize the scale of effort, given the scale of hurt and the scale of damage caused. We have far more important work to do. We must do better. This isn't to dismiss the scale of what has been achieved, or it isn't to diminish the importance of what we have delivered. Indeed, I'm making the case for its scale and importance this afternoon. But I'm equally just acknowledging the scale of what we have yet to do. The truth is, as I've argued, is that our initial and recent responses were profoundly empowered by the changes we have undertaken over the last decade. But the truth of then and now is that planning, hard work on structures and processes, on building political will and consensus and delivering reform and change, it played such a role in helping us deal with such new challenges. Within the Eurogroup, I've frequently been struck by the level of consensus that exists now, that there is an inherent risk of withdrawing support too early as opposed to too late. But I'm also aware of the commentary and debate on the euro area and some of the latest data releases and forecasts that remind us of the challenge we face. Indeed, our economies have entered 2021 with less momentum than we might have hoped for. Indeed, much of this reflects the trade-off we faced between health restrictions and how we can open up our economy. And there's no doubt at all that we need to redouble our efforts in terms of the availability of vaccines within Europe. As president of the Eurogroup, I'm under no illusion at all as to the scale of the challenge we face to ensure that the euro area recovers quickly and sustainably, that we have a recovery. So in time, budgetary policy will need to become even more targeted to those sectors and to those citizens most in need. Because while COVID has affected every economy, it's been a particular challenge for young women and men, and also those employed in contact-intensive sectors. There is a risk of long-term economic scarring. So aside from income and business supports, we need to provide the necessary supports of training, of reskilling, of upskilling, to allow for the right ways of economies changing. And as part of this, I see the Recovery Fund playing a key role, because there is a pressing need to raise investment in both physical and human capital. Next generation EU will be a critical catalyst to this. It will allow member states the unique opportunity to channel investment in the areas where it's needed the most, to pull in private investment, to deliver for our citizens. It can and will make a big difference. This is why it needs to be implemented quickly. And as finance ministers, our decisions around budgetary strategy will shape the economic recovery. This encompasses short-term decisions in relation to income protection and more medium-term decisions on budgetary sustainability and targeted supports and longer-term investments. But my key takeaway is that our emergency responses were greatly enhanced by our collective will, which shaped close coordination and consensus, and so too will be our recovery responses. We must use the unprecedented mobilization of political will to set the stage for coordinated reforms and a coordinated recovery. Whether this is in the areas of banking reform, capital markets, the role of the euro, or the overall budgetary framework. At Eurogroup, we have priorities in each of these areas. And over the coming months, I'd envisage debate with my colleagues on the appropriate budgetary stance, particularly as vaccinations are rolled out, as recovery begins. We will look closely at what has happened in the second half of this year, but also in terms of the appropriate strategy for next year. I'm firmly of the belief that a coordinated euro area budgetary approach will be far greater than the sum of its individual parts, that it will reinforce the impact of national plans. And I'm encouraged by the consensus as we build this discussion. Such consensus is vital for decisions to respect the core European principle of shared sovereignty, but also to maintain the support of our citizens for solidarity to deliver a European recovery for all. So, in conclusion, I know I've covered a fair bit in these few words. From the perspective of a politician and as a finance minister, the world continues to watch our actions in response to COVID-19, as does every individual citizen. It is true that our European interconnectedness was intertwined with the spread of the contagions that caused both of the major crises in the life of the euro. Yet it was precisely this reservoir of interconnectedness, of shared destiny, of solidarity that have allowed us to take the steps required to emerge stronger and more unified from these events. Through this, we will prevail. So let me again end with Camus, when he wrote in The Plague, and indeed it could be said that once the faintest stirring of hope became possible, the dominion of plague was ended. So let us redouble our efforts as Europeans to reach that precious and that healthy destination. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister Donohoe, for that very compelling account of what the EU and the Eurozone have done in response to the pandemic. Tremendous challenge and tremendous policy response, no doubt about it. I'd like to ask two quick questions, if I may, and then open it up to the floor. One about the recent past and maybe one about the future. You detailed the impressive set of policies that the Eurozone, the central bank, the fiscal institutions of Europe, and others have put into place, and it is a gigantic policy effort. At the same time, if I look at the numbers, And I was just having a glance at the most recent IMF update for numbers for both 2020 and 2021. Europe is the region of the world, along with Latin America, in a very close tie, where GDP contracted most last year. It contracted about 7.4% in the Eurozone, 7.5 in Latin America, 7.4 in Europe, so it's almost a tie. The world, by contrast, contracted only 3.5. The US only around 3.4, and emerging countries led by China contracted only about 2.5%. So Europe's performance, when looked at from the narrow lens of GDP, is not quite stellar. Is this simply an artifact of the sanitary situation? Or is there something else, if you could rewind history, that economic and monetary and fiscal policy could have done differently to contain more sharply the collapse in output and employment last year?
Thank you very much, Professor, for that question. And indeed, in my own speech there, I did want to acknowledge that perspective on the euro area performance, because in making the case for the scale of response from the euro area, it's also important to acknowledge the perspective and commentary on our performance and to give a view on that. In terms of the factors that are behind that, I'd offer two that's been relevant to the analysis of those figures, and then I would look to the future as to how we will respond back to that challenge. The first one is to state a very, very, very obvious issue, which of course is within the euro area. We have so many different countries that in the early phases of responding back to this crisis did respond back in different ways and at different speeds. The second point I make, and I know, again, this is a very obvious point to make to such a learned audience, is that in evaluating the performance of the euro area over time, as critical as it will be to look at what has happened with GDP and indeed with employment, I think you should also factor in the magnitude of interventions that were put in place to protect income, to protect social cohesion at a time of such strain. And I would respectfully make the case that due to the interventions that were put in place in the euro area and more broadly within the European Union, there was a really high value but on how we could protect income stability and jobs at a time of great strain. And I think that's also a valuable and a positive metric for evaluating the performance of the euro area. All that being said, as somebody who is so deeply privileged to represent the euro area to you this afternoon, I do want to acknowledge the commentary that's there and say that from engaging with my finance minister colleagues that I do, as I do every single day, there's a relentless determination from us now to look at how we can use the Recovery and Resilience Fund and also the vast reserves of financial strength that still exist at a national level to deliver the strongest possible recovery for the people of the euro area and the people of the European Union. Because we are all conscious of the scale of challenge that we face. So as somebody who is a politician, who has the great privilege of representing people in a parliament and being a member of a government, I know from meeting citizens every day of the week, the work that lies ahead. And those figures are a macro summary of the worry and anxiety and indeed hope that the citizens of Europe face for the future. And that will be the catalyst for the finance ministers to look at how we can deliver a stronger recovery.
Thank you, Minister. I think point very well taken. The GDP figures probably overstate the problem in Europe, given that consumption, employment, and probably human welfare fell by less, and therefore, if measured in different ways, Europe probably looks better compared to the US or to other regions of the world than the GDP numbers alone might suggest. Let me ask you a question about the future. This crisis brought a tremendous change in fiscal policy in Europe, not only because the 750 billion euro recovery fund is large, very sizable, but also because this marks a threshold from the issuance of debt by single member states to the issuance of debt by the Union. These are, liabilities of the EU, not of any single country. And of course, that brings into the discussion a whole host of issues, some of which are technical, but some of which are political. Should we be looking forward to a new stage in European relations, and is the conduct of fiscal policy going to be dramatically different as a result of the issuance of these bonds? Is this the beginning of something that will happen again and again? Or are these bonds that are the joint liability of the EU a once and for all issue that is pandemic related, but we shouldn't expect more of it in the future?
Oh my God, Professor, we could spend many hours just answering the single question that you put to me there, because there are so many big topics encapsulated in it. So if I could just maybe unpick a few of the points that you have put to me. What I am respectfully doing this afternoon is simply making the case that amidst the daily rhythm of analysing how we are all doing in dealing with this disease, and the daily rhythm driven by news lines and driven by media commentary of how Europe and the Euro area is doing, I'm just looking to make the case to all of you that the scale of the response economically from the Euro area to this challenge is very, very significant. And that what it has done is built upon the institutions of the last crisis and the change of the last crisis that were then mobilized quickly to deal with this great challenge. And in that spirit, I would say two things to you. The first thing is that what we have now, we clearly have agreement on. And it's not looking to what the stage could be after that. I think there's great value in recognizing that what we have now moved to is a hugely significant response back to a crisis without precedent. And I would pick, for example, the success of the European Commission in the bonds that they have issued to pay for the SURE program. Because if you take away or take a step back from the technicalities of shared liability bonds or bond yields and institutions and so on, what does it actually mean? What it means is that the European Commission allowed national governments to pay for wage subsidy schemes to protect European citizens at a time of crisis. And by Europe issuing that debt in that way, it helped European countries to do more than they could individually. And that of itself isn't just a case of, are we moving to the next level? It's a recognition that that is a very significant change. But then to deal with your next question of what goes beyond that, I think it's only truthful to acknowledge that while we have seen change that a year ago would have looked so unlikely, the consensus is only there for that change. So is there agreement or political consensus within the Euro area for the permanent use of the RRF? The answer to that question is no. But in saying no to you, that should be accompanied by recognition that agreement to the RRF for an emergency is an achievement and an agreement of real significance and real scale. And it will help citizens and it will help European countries this year. So in acknowledging what there's not consensus for in the future, let's make the case for what there is consensus for in the present. And it's in the present we help.
Thank you, Minister. I appreciate the complexities of the issue and also the tremendous strides forward that have been made in recent months. We have about 15 minutes and lots of questions coming in through the chat. I will try to get through as many as possible. Let me begin with a question from Martin Fisher, who is a student in the MSc in Political Economy of Europe here at the LSE. And Martin would like to know about the European Banking Union, which he describes as not having been completed yet. And Martin would like to know what crucial aspects have prevented agreement on the deposit guarantee scheme, which factors might be necessary for advancing with this scheme, and whether the current crisis will provide the impetus to get the job done.
So Martin, thank you for your question. European Banking Union is a process rather than a project. Just as our banks, just as our financial sector evolves, just as the economic context to our banks evolves, so will our efforts in relation to banking union. So as I answer Martin's question, let's still recognize what has happened. Look at where we are versus where we were a decade ago. The single supervisory mechanism, a European-wide regulatory system for European significant banks. Let's look at the agreement that, for example, the Eurogroup delivered last December, where we've made a really significant change in relation to the role of the European Stability Mechanism with regard to banking union, and bringing forward the time of implementation of other really important changes in banking union. So big changes have already happened. But to deal with Martin's question for the future, what has prevented quicker progress in other elements of banking union? And one of the key elements of that has been member state governments asking themselves, do further changes present greater risks at a national level? And do the greater risks at a national level outweigh the benefits of collective progress? And that has been one of the ingredients in progress that we have yet to make. But do I believe we can make greater progress? The answer to that question is yes. We made an agreement last December that many thought would be unlikely, but we got there, we delivered it. It took time, it was hard, required a huge amount of effort, but we did it. And one of the things that I'll now be doing in cooperation with all of my finance minister colleagues is in April, and then again in May, in the run-up to the Eurozone summit of June, we will be indicating how we believe further progress could be made on other elements of banking union. And as Martin will know, deposit insurance schemes are one of the 4 pillars of banking union. And while further progress on these pillars is really challenging, I do believe we can make progress. And I'll be working with my colleagues in the Euro area to outline our thoughts on that matter well before the summer. But COVID, the challenge of a recovery as opposed to a rebound, has changed the context for those debates, Professor, and all of my colleagues are aware of that.
Thank you, Minister. I will jump into the next question given our limited time. Let me move on to the question by Jerry Lawler, who's at the Institute of International and European Affairs in Dublin. And the question is, the ECB is currently examining proposals to pursue a digital Europe and has concluded the public consultation on this initiative. What would a digital euro mean for the future of the euro area? And when are we likely to see this change come into being?
So isn't it a sign of the new times that we're in, that I'm standing in Dublin, speaking to London, with a question being put to me from Dublin? A sign of, again, the small reminder of our changed circumstances. So many, again, different issues within all of that. The ECB have completed their public consultation on the future of an euro. And indeed, in the public consultation, it's really noticeable that amidst the huge amount of contact they got, how prominent the issues of privacy were from those who participated in that consultation. It will be up to the ECB now, who are our bank, but they're an independent central bank, of course, to outline their views in relation to the feasibility now of an euro and how that would happen and when. And we await further comment from them on that matter in the coming months. Politically, just a few observations on it. The first one is that the future of a digital euro is clearly a matter that is very related to whether the euro has a bigger international role. Secondly, we shouldn't underestimate the significance of a potential change to a digital currency in the day-to-day lives of citizens, for whom, after all, the most practical expression of having a currency is how they use it to pay and how they use it to save. So this is if such a development were to happen, it would matter to citizens in a way that perhaps is without precedent since the launch of the euro itself. And then finally to say that clearly one of the issues that is very important to finance ministers and obviously the ECB and central bank community would be in the development of such a currency, what that would mean for the transmission of monetary policy and what that would also mean for broader macro financial stability issues. So there are some of the considerations that will matter to us. It's a really important development for consumers and citizens were it to happen. It's an issue in which there are really significant political matters that would require consensus on, and our colleagues and partners in the ECB will be exercising their independent mandate in the next stage of this process.
Thanks very much. What a fascinating subject. We have several colleagues here at the LSE who've been writing about digital currencies and what this might mean, not just for the euro, but for central banks everywhere. We look forward to what the ECB might bring to the world in the coming months and years. We have lots of questions, and I do not want to give some people the floor over others. So if I may, Minister, I'm going to read out 3 questions which are broadly related and give you a few minutes to elaborate on any aspect you find you want to answer or tackle. First question is from Carlotta Brandis, who is a student in Theory and History of International Relations here at the LSE. And she says, to what extent would you have wished for closer European integration and coherence in the policies for handling the pandemic? Norbert Rice, no academic affiliation, maybe also an LSE person. Norbert says, the COVID crisis has been an accelerator of imbalances within the euro area. I imagine he was referring to current account imbalances. Is there a path to further integration that will eliminate such imbalances? Or, I quote, can we only look forward to a collection of band-aids for dealing with this problem? And the third question is from Philip Nelson, who's a member of the British-German Association. And Philip says, do tensions between member states over political views have an impact on prospects for the Europe, for its development and expansion in the future? Philip doesn't clarify exactly what political rifts he's talking about, but I can think of quite a few. I'm sure, Minister, you can think of quite a few, but I will let you choose the ones you find relevant. Over to you.
Look, thanks very much for those 3 great questions. To deal with the first one, I think in the early phases of dealing with COVID-19, there was a case to be made for greater coordination of public health measures. You know, we were in a place for a period of time in which the travel and the decisions that were made in relation to the management of borders, and also decisions that were made in relation to the sharing of equipment and the procurement of vital equipment were clearly very, very difficult, because each member state was grappling with its own national crisis. And I think it's fair to say across that particular period, it was a challenging period that provided a catalyst for better coordination and cooperation in latter phases of dealing with this emergency. In relation to the second question that was put to me about macroeconomic imbalances, indeed, the European Commission in January published a paper in relation to macroeconomic imbalances and the impact that it could have on the sustainable future of the euro area. And probably the one that I'm most aware of as a politician is what it means for employment, particularly for younger European citizens, and the great risk that we could face that the same sectors, such as hospitality, such as aviation, such as services sectors, the same sectors in all of the economies of the euro area deal with a similar shock at the same time, and what it means for the ability of those areas to recover, because they are really significant from an employment point of view in many European economies, many national economies. And that is a key risk that we have all identified. But then in relation to like Band-Aid responses back, and Professor, you know, you'll appreciate this as a finance minister who dealt with a great crisis and experienced the strains of it. You know, one person's Band-Aid is another person's intervention that has saved a job or protected an income. And what has happened in dealing with the last year is an economic response from the euro area that is without precedent in trying to protect its citizens from dealing with an economic shock that's caused by a public health emergency. And in dealing, as always, with the understandable rhythm of where we are on a day-to-day basis, there was much that was put in place over the last year that really mattered. But let's also acknowledge that the challenge ahead of us is still great, and we still have much to do and much change to make. And then in relation to the final point and the final question that was put to me. So I'm not going to, it's very difficult, Professor, when you put a question to me like that, to know what was the tone in which the question was put. Because we are bereft of a physical space, we're bereft of a lecture hall or a public event. And I think sometimes when the adjective political is used in an economic debate like this, it's sometimes occasionally used perhaps to diminish or underestimate the kind of perspective that is sometimes offered by governments and by ministers. So when one of my colleagues raises a view regarding whether the creditworthiness that their country could offer and the release of funds that their taxpayers may be contributing to, when they raise a question regarding how that money or creditworthiness that is being used, that isn't just a political concern. That is a concern that they are raising on behalf of a government, on behalf of responses and issues within a parliament, that reflects the fact that we're a union of democracies, and that political debate is how we make progress. And similarly, when a colleague of mine says that Europe needs to do more and we need to help each other more, they're making that point in response often to great difficulty and great suffering, as I saw from too many of my colleagues across April, May, and June of last year. So a political concern or a political view isn't to diminish that view. It's to remind us that at heart, the euro is an economic project built on political foundations. And it's also to remind us that the European project is a collection of democracies. That's our strength. That's us using interdependence as a source of strength. And it might sometimes mean decision-making processes that are intense, that are difficult, that sometimes take time. But those decision-making processes in turn sometimes lead to decisions and projects that are truly sustainable. And that, my colleagues in the LSE, is what I'm making the case for to all of you this afternoon.
Thank you very, very much, Minister, for those compelling words on very difficult issues that you tackle there toward the end. I'm looking at my clock. We're a minute or two past the finishing time, so I'm going to thank you again, reiterate how delighted and honored we are to be hosting you at the LSE. We hope to see you again, and I'll hand it back to Maurice. Thank you again, Minister.
Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Donohoe, also from our side, and the opportunity to discuss the Euro with you this afternoon. From the German Society, we wish you continued success in navigating the Eurozone during these critical times. We will now continue with another important topic, especially for Ireland, the EU-UK relationship. Our discussants will be the Minister Donohoe's German colleague, Vice Chancellor Olaf Scholz, and former Prime Minister Tony Blair. Thanks again, Minister, Professor Velasco, and all other attendees.
Thank you.
Bye.